Several years ago, James Watson wrote an article of sorts. It was kind of a parody, tongue-in-cheek treatment of Planned Parenthood's mission to provide abortions and safe-sex practices for teenagers. Here's what he wrote. We've heard a lot about pro-choice these last many years. We too want to avoid legislating our morals. Ethics are a personal choice and not a political or even a religious concern. That's why we have established planned bank robbery. While we don't personally approve of bank robbery, we don't want to inflict our values on anyone else either. We are pro-choice when it comes to bank jobs. It's a personal decision. Education is essential. It's shocking how many teens don't know how banks are robbed, or how to load a 357, or how to drive a getaway car, or how to yell, "Turn over the money, fool," or "You're toast." Our young people need to be educated. We are also concerned that many young people are robbing banks without proper protection. Personal injury is a much greater crime than bumping off First National. So while we don't condone bank robbery, if young people are going to do it anyway, we want to offer them the protection they need. Ski masks, bulletproof vests, and even a getaway car. It's just the compassionate thing to do. And they shouldn't need the permission of narrow-minded parents who try to force their morality on their children. Teens should make their own decisions. So our help is completely confidential. We are pro-choice after all. The most destructive lie Satan has whispered in terms of human life is this one: life in the womb has no inherent value. Since 1973, when abortion was made legal in our country, the number of infants who have been terminated, their pregnancies terminated in the womb, has been over 65 million. That's a small number compared to that number terminated worldwide. 73 million babies are aborted in our world each year. Those statistics come to us from the Guttmacher Institute, which is an arm of the pro-abortion movement. Satan whispers, that's not a baby. It's not life. It doesn't have the same value as humans do. But what do scriptures tell us? Scriptures tell us, first of all, that God knows us even before we are born. Those are the words he spoke to his prophet in Jeremiah 1:5 as we read God's words to him. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. That verse tells us that God loves us. That word know is a very special word in the Hebrew language. It doesn't mean to know about someone. God's not saying, I knew who you were going to be. God said, I knew you. It's the Hebrew word that describes a personal, intimate knowledge of someone that's based on a relationship with that person. It's the same word that God used when he spoke these words to Moses in Exodus 30, verse 12. I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. It's the same word that's used to describe Adam in his relationship with Eve in Genesis 4:1, when it says Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. That word know is not just a euphemism because the Bible is so proper. It is a word that tells us there was a personal relationship, a deep love of one person for the other. That word is used many times throughout the Old Testament to describe God in his relationship with us and to call us to a similar relationship with him. David gave testimony of that, the King David that is, when he wrote these words in Psalm 139, verses 1 and 2. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. He described a personal, intimate knowledge, a knowledge with God based upon a relationship between the two of them. God knows us with a loving, personal knowledge. That Hebrew word for to know is pronounced yada. Scholars have defined it as a mingling together of the souls. That's the concept God was conveying to Jeremiah when he said, I knew you. God's soul and Jeremiah's soul were mingled together in a relationship even before Jeremiah was born. Does this imply that the unborn child has a soul? Yes, I believe that it does. And therefore, if a child is miscarried before reaching full term and born into this world in the natural way, that child's soul goes to heaven. Some of you have children in heaven you've not yet met. They are waiting there to meet you. God knows and loves each unborn child. And in fact, before we are born, he even has plans for our lives. We find that as we go back to our sermon text in Jeremiah 1:5 and read the rest of the verse. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. God had plans for Jeremiah. They were plans for which God had created him and had given him his certain skill set, his certain nature, his certain personality, because God planned him to be a part of God's greater plan for the nation of Israel. In a similar way, God has plans for us. And so he gave us our personality and our gifts and our spirit, the personal spirit that drives us and makes us who we are, because we have a purpose for being here. David gave testimony of that as we go back to Psalm 139 and read in verse 16 when David writes, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. God knows us. He loves us. He has plans for us. Even before we were born, we have value, even while we are in the womb. God, in fact, gave us life in the womb. I believe the scriptures indicate that life begins at conception. We're going to look at a couple of Bible verses in the Old Testament that might give us a clue that that is the case. The first of those is the account of God creating Adam, the first man. And that creation account is partly described in Genesis 2:7, when it says, Jehovah God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into him the breath of life, and man became a living soul. It wasn't the existence of the body that defined life. It was when the soul was introduced into that body that life began. It was then that Adam became animated and drew breath and became a living soul. That word for soul that we saw in that verse is sometimes translated with different words in the Old Testament and other passages. Sometimes it's translated spirit. Sometimes it's translated life. Sometimes it's translated breath. The point that it's making is that the life of the body, when the body breathes and demonstrates signs of life, is dependent upon the presence or the absence of the soul in that body. That's consistent with what we read David wrote in Psalm 104, verse 29, when he said, when you take away their spirit or soul, they die and return to dust. The absence of the spirit or the soul from the body means the body has died. Therefore, we could reason that the presence of the soul or the spirit in the body is equated with life. So unborn babies are living human beings equipped with a soul. Let's go back again to Psalm 139 and read what David wrote in verse 15. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. In other words, when we are in the womb, God knows us so well. He knows exactly who we are. He knows what our characteristics and our personality and even our looks are going to be. And we know that's true because at conception, a person's features are already determined. Our discoveries in DNA research demonstrate to us that is the case. When DNA is inside of us, it determines what we will look like. It determines several of our features and even perhaps our personality and the way that we will approach things. And so it was determined in the womb of his mother that David would be a boy. It was also determined what color his hair would be, and what color his eyes would be, and what color his skin tone would be. It was also determined at that time that he would have great musical ability and songwriting skills and the courage to face giants. God decided that and gave David those features and abilities because God created him while in the womb to be the person he was going to be. And so before birth, we are human beings who are going to become what God created us to be. That claim that I just made is denied by our secular world. For example, the Supreme Court in Canada tried to dodge the whole moral dilemma of abortion by denying that we are created as human beings and we are living human beings in the womb. In fact, that Supreme Court ruled that a fetus is not a human being. The court decided that as if they have the authority to define life instead of God. The discussion of abortion and whether or not it's ethical used to be based upon a question of viability. That is, whether or not the fetus could survive outside the womb. The time of viability was determined to be the time when a fetus became a child, and that fetus became a person, and life began. But due to modern medical technology, the age of viability has moved to a much earlier time in a woman's pregnancy, thus eliminating that argument. And so now the definition has changed in the pro-abortion movement. It has been replaced with one called fetal sentience. Fetal sentience. Maybe you've not heard that term. I had not heard that term until doing some research on this topic this past week. Fetal sentience is the point at which an unborn child can feel pleasure and pain and emotions. And of course, no one knows when that is, and that's the point. Because it can be assigned to any pre-birth age, thus supporting the pro-abortion viewpoint that it's not a child until we think it is a child. A more recent definition of when life begins is when a child becomes self-aware. And of course, pro-abortionists are saying that a child is not really self-aware while in the womb. And so this is applied to after birth. When does a child become self-aware? Is it at 1 or 2 months or 6 months or later than that? What a dangerous presupposition. Some who believe this therefore suggest it is ethically permissible to kill a newborn if that baby's birth threatens the well-being of the family in any way, because, they say, that child is not considered a person because he or she is not yet self-aware. It's what has become called after-birth abortion. Do you see where humanity has arrived since we began to claim that life is not a sacred gift from God? Scriptures teach that life begins in the womb. It's at conception that God knows us. At conception, God has determined who we will be. At conception, God commences our life, and that life is sacred. The pro-life movement has coined a phrase, the sanctity of life. That means that life is sacred. It is a holy gift from God, and therefore it has great value. But Satan whispers it does not. He has convinced humankind that life is disposable. And secular society believes that life is cheap. So cheap, in fact, that in our country, abortions are done primarily for the sake of the convenience of the woman. Less than 2% of abortions are performed in our country for the purposes of rape or incest. And about 2% are performed for medical necessities. Those statistics, by the way, also come to us from the Guttmacher Institute. Those are not pro-life claims. So the pro-abortion movement admits that over 96% of the abortions performed in our country are done for the sake of convenience. Life is even cheaper than that in other countries. In China, some abortions are performed for gender preference. A family limited by the government to have only 2 children already has given birth to a daughter, when they find that the mother is expecting another and it too is a female. And so they elect to abort that baby and try for a male, and will continue down that path until they finally succeed in getting the son that they want. But life is even cheaper than that in other countries. In India, some abortions are done for the sake of preferred astrological signs. We didn't want a Sagittarius. We wanted a Gemini. The stars tell us that a Gemini will work better in our family than a Sagittarius. So we're going to abort that baby and try again to get one under the proper sign. How far Satan has led mankind away from God. In the book Beating Hearts, Abortion and Animal Rights, 2 Cornell University professors rationalized their simultaneous support for animal rights on one hand and opposition for rights for the unborn on the other. They contend that man is simply another animal enjoying no greater moral status and no uniqueness, and only some differences in the degree of evolution over animals. They argue, therefore, that human life is no more important than animal life. But some in that movement go a step further, believing, in fact, that humans have less of a right to life than animals. For while they believe that it is wrong to eat a fertilized chicken egg, thus ending the life of an unhatched chicken, they accept the abortion of human embryos. How does that make sense? In Genesis 1, 26 through 28, we read these words. God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." We have been created in the image of God. Animals are not. God set human life above that of animal life in value. I find that this whole issue of pro-abortion or pro-life, it's really a spiritual issue. Or you might say it's a faith issue. John Evans, a sociology professor at the University of California in San Diego, surveyed 3,500 adults about the value of human life. He discovered that those who believe humans bear the image of God hold to more humanitarian attitudes than those who do not. The more people believe that mankind evolved and have no divine origin or no divinely appointed purpose, the more likely they are to view humans as having no special value. In other words, it's the presence or the absence of Christian faith more than any other factor which will determine whether a person is pro-life or pro-abortion. It's a faith issue. But it's also a moral issue. When a woman proclaims, "My body, my right," and does not give that same consideration to the life inside of her womb, that's immoral. When a movement will not protect a life simply because that life has no voice of its own, that's immoral. When a society refuses to help the helpless, that's immoral. And our society has rallied to help every other helpless individual, the homeless and the unemployed and the addicted, those oppressed by bad governments and those impoverished by bad economies. But for the last 50 years, our society has turned away from helping the most helpless of all, those totally dependent upon the care and the compassion of a mother. And instead, our society has given her the right and the resources to destroy that helpless life. That's immoral. This sermon was planned for this date long before I knew we would have a special election this Tuesday. It has to be God's timing. You have the opportunity to vote Tuesday on an issue that will directly affect the protection of unborn life. Our state government finally did the moral thing last year, making abortion on demand illegal. But now pro-abortionists are gathering support to overturn that new law. The Ohio Constitution can be changed by 50.1% of the popular vote. Ohio is one of only 8 states with a threshold that low. Even the U.S. Constitution requires a 2/3 majority vote for such a change. If our federal government recognizes the wisdom of a convincing majority to change the Constitution, shouldn't our state government also? I never speak from the pulpit about political issues unless they have moral implications, and this one does. A yes vote Tuesday will raise the percentage needed to change the state constitution from 50.1% to a 60% majority, thus making it more difficult for abortion on demand to become legal again and available to minors without parental consent. That's what the proposal is. Satan is whispering lies into the ears of anyone who will listen. But God's voice can be heard above it if we listen. God is calling us to truth and righteousness. God is calling us to do the moral thing. He does that all the time, whether it's about this issue or any other. May God's voice ring louder in our ears. May His voice sound more attractive to us than the whispered lies of Satan, whatever the topic might be. God calls us. God calls us to life. I don't mean just life in this world. He has an even greater purpose for us than living the life He has planned for us in this world, and that's living eternally with Him in the next. Satan whispers, it's just a myth. It doesn't exist. You're here and you're gone and it's over with. But God tells us a different story. Listen to His voice as He speaks to you.